All right, let's jump right in. There's a pretty bold idea making waves in New Zealand right now. And let's be real, it can be a confronting one. The idea of abolishing prisons altogether. Now, I know that's a topic that gets a strong reaction, right? But before we dive into the debate, our job here is just to get a handle on what's actually being proposed. So before we go any further, I want to be super clear about our goal with this explainer. It's all about understanding this proposal. What is it? Why does it even exist? And what are the huge questions it raises for all of us? We are absolutely not here to tell you what to think. Our job is to lay out the information so you can think it through for yourself. So here it is, the big question, the one that Te Pāti Maori has put on the table. Could New Zealand really get rid of all its prisons by 2040? I mean, on the surface, that sounds pretty radical, right? So what does that actually mean in practice? Okay, and this is a really, really important point to get right away. The proposal isn't about, just flinging open the prison doors tomorrow. Not at all. It's talking about a slow 20-year transition, a shift away from incarceration as the go-to answer, and instead putting that energy and money into things like prevention and rehabilitation. Which, of course, brings us to the big why. I mean, a proposal this massive doesn't just appear out of thin air. It's a direct response to some really deep, long-standing problems in our justice system. So let's take a look at the numbers that are really driving this whole conversation. And this stat right here, well, it really gets to the very heart of the issue for those calling for change. Think about this. Maori make up around 17% of New Zealand's total population, but they account for more than half of the people in prison. Supporters of this proposal argue that this isn't a reflection on Maori people, but rather it's a giant flashing sign that the system itself is failing them and has been for generations. And all of this feeds into what supporters would call a completely broken cycle. You've got high incarceration rates, people getting out and then reoffending, and the massive financial cost of it all. There's this growing sense that even with all the money we're pouring in, our communities aren't actually getting safer in the long term. For proponents, the key takeaway is this. The current way of doing things, the status quo, just isn't working. Okay, so this is probably the biggest question on everyone's mind, right? If you're talking about getting rid of prisons, then what replaces them? Let's dig into what the proposed alternatives actually look like. So the idea isn't just one single thing. It's more like a whole system of different layers. It starts way at the beginning, trying to prevent crime from happening in the first place with early intervention. Then, for people who do offend, the focus completely shifts. We're talking about wraparound support for things like mental health and addiction, community-led restorative justice processes, and a huge focus on rehabilitation and education, all with the goal of finally breaking that cycle. Okay, let's just hit pause here for a second because it feels like a good moment to reset. This is obviously a really complex and honestly a very emotional topic. People have strong feelings about it, and you know what? That's completely valid. So I just want to remind everyone, our only goal here is to understand the different perspectives, because you really have to understand something before you can agree or disagree with it. All right, with that said, let's get into what is probably the most contentious part of this whole discussion, the concerns, the counterarguments, and the political firestorm around this idea. And these are the questions that for a lot of New Zealanders come up immediately. And they're not just side issues, they are absolutely central to this debate. Things like, how would we deal with serious violent crime? How do we guarantee community safety? What about justice and protection for victims? Are these alternatives actually proven to work on a large scale? And what's the real cost? These aren't small details, they're the fundamental questions that need answers. As you can imagine, the political reaction was pretty swift, and it really mirrors these public concerns. You've got parties like National and ACT calling the plan unrealistic and dangerous, really emphasizing that prisons are a necessity for public safety. Meanwhile, Labour has kind of walked a middle line. They've acknowledged the systemic problems, but they've stopped short of supporting abolition, saying that public safety has to remain the #1 priority. And this quote here really sums up the core argument from critics. For many people, the #1 job of the justice system is to keep the public safe by separating dangerous people from the community. From that point of view, prisons aren't seen as a failure of the system. They're seen as an essential part of it. But supporters, they frame this completely differently. They'll point to places like Norway and argue that a heavy focus on rehabilitation can actually make society safer in the long run because it lowers reoffending rates. They argue the real prize here is breaking those intergenerational cycles of trauma and crime, which they believe leads to stronger families and ultimately safer communities for everyone. And it's worth taking a second to look at that international context. You hear places like Norway and Germany mentioned a lot, and yeah, they've had success. But it's really important to understand that their success isn't just about having better prisons. It's built on top of a huge investment in what you'd call upstream prevention. Robust social safety nets, mental health care, education, all the things that can stop crime from happening in the first place. Okay, so let's bring this all back home. We've talked about policy and politics, but what does this debate actually mean for you, for your family, and for your community? Because at the end of the day, this debate is about some really fundamental things. It's about what community safety actually looks like. It's about how we spend our public money. Is building and running prisons the best use of those billions of dollars? It's about how we handle youth crime. It forces all of us to ask a really tough question. What does effective justice even mean for the future of Aotearoa? So as we start to wrap this up, I just want to bring it back to where we began. This is, without a doubt, one of the most complex issues facing the country. Our purpose today wasn't to give you the answers. It was just to help you think more clearly about it all, to lay out the proposal, the why behind it, and the very real questions it raises. So where does that leave us? Well, no matter what you think about this 2040 proposal, whether you support it or you think it's a terrible idea, it forces every single one of us to confront a pretty tough question. Is the system we have right now, is the status quo actually working? Is it delivering the safe and just Aotearoa that we all want to live in? And really, that's the question at the very heart of this entire debate.